We are in Luke chapter 2. One of our speakers at the conference this week brought out the topic of love, and from Paul's standpoint and the number of people that were with him. And even though I knew it, and as we introduced the Gospel of Luke to you, we said that Luke was a physician, and we knew that from his travels with Paul. But somehow I had never wedded the two, that Luke was one who traveled with a master of the presentation of the Gospel. Luke was a part of that amazing team with Trophimus and Titus and Timothy and Tertius and Secundus and all those other guys. But you can imagine Luke being a part of that team, and then at some point in that huge relationship with the missionary journeys, with the Apostle Paul, Luke is writing to this guy in Luke chapter 1, verse, I'm looking for his name, verse 3, Theophilus. This whole book is written to this guy named Theophilus. And because Luke was who he was, and as you already know, Luke uses big words. And if he can use a Greek word that is only used once in the Bible, whereas everybody else uses the one that's used 1,000 times, he'll use the one that's used once. So he's smart, he's methodical, he is, I'm so grateful, a sleuth. He has done his homework. And even as we finished up with both Simeon and Anna, you realize that we had the quote from Simeon in chapter 2 on all the things that Simeon had said to Joseph and Mary, and specifically to Mary. But when we got to Anna, it was just a synopsis of, she was thankful, and she continued to give thanks, and then she continued speaking to others about this baby. And why was that? Well, because when Luke did his homework, Simeon was most likely, and I'm going to say 99.9% sure, that Simeon was still alive. So he went up and talked to Simeon and said, "Hey, Simeon, tell me about your relationship with Joseph, Mary, and the family." And so Simeon did. But if you remember, anybody remember how old Anna was? 105 or 106, depending on which part of the year she was born in. I'm pretty sure, I'm 99.9% sure that Anna was dead. And so the recollection would have been from others, maybe even from Simeon, maybe from Mary, that Anna came up and they couldn't recall all that she said. And Luke couldn't go and talk to Anna because Anna was dead. So we have gone through this story so far, and Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2 are totally introductory to what I hope you don't call it the good stuff, but the good stuff. When Jesus preaches, and when Jesus heals, and when Jesus ministers, and when Jesus confronts, all the adult ministry things of Jesus in the other chapters of Luke, Luke gives us the pre-questions on, so we have Jesus, so where did he come from? And Luke goes back and he gives us the pre-story with Zacharias and Elizabeth, who are going to be the parents of John the Baptist. Who is who? He's the forerunner of the Messiah. So John's ministry is actually going to be taking place before Jesus' ministry, because John the Baptist is the forerunner. And so we found all of that in chapter 1. And the whole message to Mary that she's going to conceive. And the fact that this is going to be a God thing. It's not going to be a family thing in the sense of Joseph and Mary, although it's going to end up with that, because Joseph has divine intervention saying, no, you're going to marry her. And you're going to take care of this amazing supernatural thing that's in her womb right now, because what's in her womb right now is from heaven. It's divine. And so Joseph, we found in Matthew that very night, went and took her as his wife. So we finished up with chapter 1, and we got to chapter 2 where we have the Christmas story, and then the various attestations, the angels ministering to the shepherds, who then the shepherds go and minister and acknowledge what is transpired in Bethlehem with this brand new babe. It's crazy good stuff. And then as Joseph and Mary, who are new to the family scene, have the divine one in their arms, he is circumcised the 8th day, given his name, which was given by heaven, both to Joseph and Mary. And then at the 40th day, they take the family, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus go to Jerusalem, and they have a second and a third attestation that who they have in their arms is the one that has been promised in the Old Testament. So good, amazing things that are attestations to Joseph and Mary, because we did find, and Mary pondered these things in her heart, so she's storing all that up. I mean, none of us have ever been, none of our families have ever had a supernatural, divine intervention when it comes to conception, as far as having a divine being in us. So this is totally new. Mary, totally new, and the only. I mean, when it says it, when John calls him the only begotten of the Father, that's because Jesus was the only one ever in human history. No matter what other books you read or other religions there are, Jesus is the only one. So Mary ponders these things in her heart, and we have to let her do that. We have to walk down that path with her and Joseph, saying, who are we holding? What do we have? And how do we handle this? And of course, all of us that are parents know that it's crazy to try to figure out how to deal with our own kids. The easy thing in the comparison is that Jesus was divine and perfect and sinless, whereas our kids, we know, are not that. So we get through the temple, and you can see the question in Luke chapter 2, verses 39 and 40 is, how and where did Jesus grow up? If we just read verse 39 of Luke chapter 2, and it says, and when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. What we have there, and if I was going to just use Luke and not pay attention to anything else in history, what I would read there is that Anna and Simeon have now walked away. Joseph and Mary have paid their price. The price has been paid to redeem Jesus and to pay for Mary's cleanliness, purification. And they get on their horse, donkey, whatever, and go right back to Nazareth. That's not the case. And how do we know that? Such a thing as something called Matthew chapter 2. What happens in Matthew chapter 2? There's the wise men, we call them. They're actually the Magi. And the Magi have seen his star in the east. And for the sake of a shortened version, I'm going to say that these were wise men is an appropriate interpretation. So we can go there. If we call them Magi, sometimes people add a C at the end and call them magic people. And it's like, no, let's not go there. They weren't sorcerers. They weren't those kind of weird guys. They were intelligent, smart guys who probably, in fact, I'm going to go with the 99.9% sure, that they looked at the stars. And of the Eastern, Eastern empires, Eastern countries, the Babylonians were the ones that paid the most attention to the stars. So, again, without a lot of discussion, I'm just going to say skip that. Wise men from Babylon saw his star and knew that the king had been born. And there's a lot of things involved in that Matthew doesn't give us, and so we have to look at it historically, and there's things going on. And the interesting concept with regards to we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him is we don't know when that star appeared. We don't know if it was the night in which the Messiah was born or the night that Mary conceived in her womb. So you kind of go, I mean, I've always said it was the night in which Jesus was born. Why do I say that? Because that's the only thing I ever thought of. And that's what the manger scene shows. So traditionally, we think in terms that they have, well, actually that would be impossible because they'd have to have one of those bullet trains that go from nowhere to nowhere. So it'd have to be from like Siberia to South Africa. Oh, that was just a political statement. Sorry. Forgive me. Hope nobody's paying attention to that. They couldn't get there if they couldn't get there, period. If the manger scene is true, then the star would have had to have appeared in the night in which Mary conceived. So there you go. So we don't know that. We don't know if there are three. We base that, of course, on the gifts, right? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Could have been two, because it's plural. But it could have been 8. We don't know. You with me so far? So I bring that up because what happens after that? They go down, and interestingly enough, I don't know how they did it, but they left Jerusalem after meeting with King Herod, figuring that King Herod would have known where this king was born and so on. And the King Herod was totally ignorant. And he covertly, he's a fox, he covertly asked them certain questions in certain ways. And they leave alone. So none of the secret police, and I say that I'm 99.9% sure that Herod had secret police. Don't you love that 99.9? I can't say I'm 100% because I wasn't there, okay? And it doesn't say secret police. It just, anyway. So none of them went with him. And when we find in Matthew that finally they show up and they see the mother and her son, they do what? They do obeisance to him. They worship him in the Oriental fashion. They get down on their faces. These are wise men who probably have the most prestigious jobs in Babylon, apart from being king, and they're doing obeisance to King Jesus, who probably she was still holding him in her arms. Because we know that after this, Herod decides that he's going to kill the king. And you remember what age that was? 2 years old and under. So in Bethlehem and its environs, he kills all the male babies 2 years old and under. So in a sense, we assume that Jesus was 2 years old. But then we go back and we kind of look at perhaps the star came on the night in which Mary conceived in her womb, which doesn't make Jesus 2. It makes him 1 year and 3 months. So when we read that Herod did 2 years old and younger, that's kind of like us when we see an ant in the yard, we spray the whole yard just to make sure we get all the ants, rather than just, there's the ant, I spray him. So what Herod was doing was casting out a net and making sure that he got him. The environs, so if it was Bethlehem, if it was in Santa Margarita, there was a chance it could have been in San Luis and Atascadero as well. So we're just going to kill the baby boys in Atascadero and San Luis as well. That work for you? Of course it doesn't, but it did for Herod, because he was nasty. What we find in Matthew is that it's such a dangerous situation that God wakes Joseph up and says, get out now. and go to Egypt. And it's not like, think about it, or make sure you go to Trader Joe's and pick up some yogurt for the trip. No, it's get up and get out of here now. Well, since we know that Herod killed the babies in Bethlehem and its environs, there'd be absolutely zero reason for him in Nazareth to leave Nazareth of Galilee and skirt the whole area of Israel down on the coast and go down to Egypt. The logic and the conclusion is that Matthew and Mark are wedded, and that Matthew gives us this information on the fact that Joseph and Mary and Jesus left Bethlehem and its environs and went down to Egypt, where there would have been a group of Jews. Jews were scattered out over the earth. They just went. And so there would have been a Jewish community in Egypt easily, hands down. And then, I think on the heels of them leaving, Herod's guys show up and they murder the boys. And statistics have been done. It sounds horrible. It sounds like, there's probably about 400 boys in Atascadero and Santa Margarita and San Luis. It ends up probably there's about 6 to 10 boys in Bethlehem, 2 years old and younger. So it's not hundreds, but it still doesn't matter, right? I mean, it doesn't. Murder is murder, and that's what Herod did. So Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are in Egypt, and Herod continues to live approximately another year and a half, roughly, so that from the time that, roughly, so from the time they leave Bethlehem, go to Egypt, Herod dies, and then it's a mess. You talk about somebody leaving an obscure will, or a will that hates him and likes him. And so the sons, somebody gets this, but somebody else doesn't get that. And Archelaus is the guy that's in charge now in Jerusalem. And Archelaus is the head of Antifa. How's that? In other words, he's a nice guy. Good. Some of you laughed because you know what Antifa is. Some guys didn't like the fact that Herod had put an eagle, which would have been a no-no for the Jews, on an entrance into the temple. And so a couple guys pulled it down. Well, then he surrounds that particular area and 3,000 Jews die. Sounds like a nice, fun, safe, happy place, right? Let's go to downtown Santa Margarita today, and who knows who will surround us and kill us all. So what happens in Egypt then at this time is that God speaks to Joseph and says, okay, you have time to go to Trader Joe's, pick up yogurt, whatever you want, but you need to go home. You can go home now, because all those who wanted to kill you, they're gone. Now think about this. Joseph had a chance to go back to Bethlehem, which it looks like they were kind of intending to stay. I mean, that's where it was the city of David. That's where his ancestors were from. Kind of works for me. Plus, if I say it this way, it's on the right side of the tracks. It's in Judea, as opposed to Galilee. Hello! I mean, Galilee, let's face it, is a step up from Samaria. But you got a lot of half-breeds up there. It's simply the wrong side of the tracks. So Joseph, it simply says that God calls him back to the land of Israel. Okay, well, Israel includes all of this. So Joseph has a choice. And when he hears that Archelaus is in charge in Jerusalem, he says, not safe enough. So where does he go? He goes back to their original home in Galilee, in Nazareth. So when we read here in Luke chapter 2, verse 39, And when they finished all the things according to the law of the Lord, then they turned back to Galilee, to their own town, Nazareth. We find that, two things, that Joseph and Mary lived according to the law as best they could. To the best of their ability, they did everything they could according to the law. Which up to this point, the only thing we know is his circumcision, his redemption, buying back, paying the price to redeem the firstborn, and then Mary's purification. That's the only thing we're privy to at this time. So that was all fulfilled, and then it seems that not too long after that, these other events happen. Well, then when all of that's done, we praise it down to this one statement that Luke gives us, as opposed to all the information that Matthew gives us. It says they turned back, or they went back to Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth. So, where did Jesus grow up? It's kind of an interesting question, because you want to say, well, he was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Nazareth. But we have to remember, there's about 3.5 years that in his earliest days, he was in Egypt, away from the turmoil and death that was rife in Jerusalem at that time. Herod was a nasty guy. To talk about Stalin or Hitler, there wouldn't be too many differences. You could put Herod in that triumvirate, and you'd get about the same concept. You with me so far? So, Jesus grows up then, as we pick up at about 3.5 years old. Now we picture Jesus growing up in Nazareth. Eventually what that's going to lead to is what we find in John chapter 2, the marriage feast of Cana. How did Mary and Jesus know all these people? Because that's where he grew up. And Cana of Galilee is what? Not even 5 miles up the road from Nazareth. So, all right, so what do we have so far? So far we have that verses 39 and 40 are both a summary as well as a transition. So verses 39 and 40 of Luke chapter 2 serve as a transition from the babyhood into, as we're going to see in verse, well, it's either 41, 42, or 43. I can't see the word 12. When he becomes 12 years old and he becomes that age for the bar mitzvah, for the young man, the young Jewish man, to enter into the whole scene of Judaism. At first, as a child, he's just a child, kind of held accountable only in a sense under his parents. But when he gets to be 12, he starts putting all these things into his own life. But that's coming up. We still have to get to verse 40. Verse 40, and by the way, for those of you with notes, you see the yellow. For the most part, what I'm doing is drawing attention to the ands and the nows and the buts that Luke puts in there to move the storyline forward. And so it's kind of like, so we have this, and then we have this, and then we move on to this, but we had that. So anyway, that's what those are there for, to simply draw attention. And it seems to me that there's most of the verses have at least one of those that move the story forward. So in verse 40, we have a now rather than an and the New American Standard doesn't have an and, but it's a diminutive and, or a diminutive connection. He says, now, the child. So that's how Luke is still referring to him, because he's giving the whole story. It's a storyline that moves. And so he addresses the state of who Jesus is at this time, and Jesus is still a child. So the child, and this is an imperfect, so rather, and the NIV hits it, or the New American Standard, continued to grow. He kept on growing. And that's what we see. What Luke does in verse 40 is to summarize what in the world happened from birth to 12 years old, which we're going to catch in the upcoming story. What in the world happened? Well, he summarizes everything here, and he says he kept on growing and kept on gaining strength, and the way he gained strength was by being filled with wisdom. And so as I'm going to interpret this, and so I'm telling you that I'm interpreting it this way, that when it says he kept on growing, that means that just as you saw my 3 grandsons here, some of you are noticing, because they've been here before, that they used to be this tall, and now they're this tall, and perhaps the next time you see them, they're going to be, not at your kneecaps anymore. They keep growing, and that's a healthy thing. What Luke is telling us is there's a natural process here of normal human growth. He kept growing. There was no stunted growth. There was no accelerated growth. He just kept on growing. But the second part, and this is again, I'm telling you that this is my interpretation, he kept on gaining strength by being filled with wisdom. We get a picture not of the physical, not kneecap high and then belly button high and then chest high and then head high. Rather, we're looking at the mental and spiritual growth of Jesus. And you have to stop and think. For those of you who haven't been around little kids for a while, and some of us, that's our lives, it's crazy when all of a sudden they come up and they ask you a question. And now, I guess my grandsons have asked me so many questions, none of them really come to mind at this moment, but they keep asking these questions. And sometimes you just go, I have no idea, I've never thought of that before. What holds up the sky? I don't know! And so on. But what we find with this babe Jesus, who is fully human, and we always have to remember that. He's fully divine, so there's a perfection in him that you and I missed growing up. Remember when your parents asked you, why did you do that? And your answer was, I don't know. That's because it was your sin nature at work, and we kind of poo-pooed it or didn't pay attention to it. Well, Jesus was growing up without that. Instead, we find that he was being filled with wisdom. And this wisdom, as the notes say, this is in the biblical sense as the right knowledge of God and his salvation coupled with its application to life. In other words, there's always consequences to actions. And if you look at somebody and smile, I remember the time I was in LA before a conference, and I was just walking down an aisle, and I looked at a man, I said, hi, how you doing? Looks back at me and says, do I know you? Wow. Okay, I guess you can only say hi, how you doing if you know somebody. Okay. But if you look at somebody and frown, there's going to be a consequence. The wisdom, what Jesus did was put things together. As a boy, he began to see how things worked in life. And if somebody does that, then there's going to be that. If dad says this to mom, she's going to respond this way. He put it together. And let's see, did I do it on your notes? There should be a yellow on the last phrase, and the grace of God was upon him. And the reason I put that there was that it's kind of like we at least me, maybe not you, but I always read that as kind of one statement. And the child continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. That's how I read it. And then I realized that no, what we have over here is that Luke is telling us he's growing up. He's growing up physically, and he's growing up mentally and spiritually. And it's all coming together with each passing year that Joseph and Mary are responsible and raising their son. But the last thing, I believe, is separate and Luke wants us to pay attention to the statement. That's why I put the and in yellow, because I don't think it's one statement. I think it's two. And the grace of God was upon him. God's favor, God's acceptance. And I honestly have a hard time knowing exactly what to do with that. because we look at in the broader sense of grace as God's undeserved favor upon us, so that we who are sinners and have rejected God and shaken our fists and rebelled against Him and cursed His name up until the point when His grace allowed us to see the sacrifice of Christ appropriately. And we bowed the knee to Jesus and we responded to Jesus and we said, Jesus is the only way to take away my sin. Thank you. And that was God's grace. And that's how we see it. But sometimes the word grace is not all of that, but sometimes is very what you would call subjective. It's God's grace was extended to me in this situation. Not that I needed to be saved again, but that I didn't deserve what He gave me, and He blessed me immensely. I see that as God's grace. And when Luke says this, when I looked at this, I said, how are you going to present verse 40? Because we look at the child growing, and we have a hard enough time. I mean, I've spent 2 days with my son and my 3 grandsons, and we have a hard enough time grasping for me, my grandsons growing up so quickly, and sometimes they make bad decisions, even though Grandma and Grandpa are such loving, wonderful people, and their grandfather's a licensed pastor. Well, actually, not yet. Not for another hour, but they still make bad decisions. And yet God's grace is extended to them. And if that's the case with our sinful relationships here on earth, I have a hard time grasping the depth and the breadth of what Luke says here with God's grace was upon the child. But it's amazing. And so what verses 39 and 40 do for us, it summarizes a whole lot of information that we missed. The question is, how and where did Jesus grow up? And I couldn't tell you. It's one of the pseudepigrapha. If you know the word pseudepigrapha, simply means writing. I think it's Latin, but who knows. In one of the false writings, there's a story of the child Jesus, so it'd be between what we have in verse 39 and what we have in verse 41. Is that Jesus was at a bird bath, and he was just enjoying the birds, and then the birds splashed him, and he got upset and turned the birds to stone. And you kind of go, tilt? Seriously? Hello? Didn't happen. And we can imagine with that kind of, I'm going to say stupid, from the pulpit, story, that we go back to this and we read that he kept going stronger, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him, that it leaves a lot of room for wonderful speculation on a perfect child growing up. And we don't catch anything again until we get to verse 41, when he is 12 years old. So, we don't want to speculate, but we do want to appreciate that Jesus was perfect even in childhood. Sinless, yes, even in his childhood. And he was exposed to what Mary and Joseph exposed him to, which next week, verses 41 and following, we have the story of what transpired when he was 12 years old. And how did I label that? The Jerusalem trip, uncomfortable discovery. And I don't want to say it's a humorous story, but can you imagine losing Jesus at 12 years old? Which is in essence what they did. I mean, we have a heart attack when we turn around in the store and our child isn't gripping our leg, and we look up and down the aisle. Where did they go? Yesterday, Levi went to the bathroom while we were in the park, and it's like, "Where's Levi?" And then he walks out the door, and it's like, "Oh." So you can imagine Joseph and Mary, and we'll get the story, but Joseph and Mary lost Jesus. Well, Jesus wasn't lost, but Mary and Joseph didn't know where he was. So fascinating. But 39 and 40 serve as Luke summarizing 3.5 years. Luke transitions to, in verse 41, not that verse 41 gives us the bar mitzvah, I only say that because he turned 12. Luke emphasizes Jesus grew up in Galilee, Luke emphasizes Joseph and Mary's devotion and obedience to God and his law. Luke reveals that Jesus fulfilled all the law requirements because his parents made sure that he did. Luke summarizes Jesus' early life. Jesus grew up normally. Jesus grew up strong. Jesus increased in wisdom, and God's grace rested on him. That's the transition as well as the summary that Luke gives us in just those 2 verses. And then we move on to his pre-ministry in the rest of chapter 2, and then we move on into his ministry in Luke chapter 3. Are you with me? Okay, let's start. That was all introduction. Just kidding. Let's pray. Lord, to think in terms of our Savior coming back to us as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, riding a white horse, and fire is coming out of his mouth and a sword is in his hand, we kind of have to have a pre-story to that, because that's what's coming. And so we go to the ascension, then we go before that to the resurrection, and then we go before that to the death and burial, and then we go before that to the whole life and ministry for approximately 2.5, 3 years Jesus walked on the face of this earth. And we need, Lord, in all of that to continue to grow in our love for him. And so allow us to do that through this amazing man, Luke, who gives us the story. Allow us to continue to fall in love with our Savior. It is truly, for us, all about Jesus. And so as we leave this place today, may we be resolved to contemplate him and all that he means to us on a day-by-day basis. So go before us, Lord. Bring us from where we are and lead us to where we need to be for Christ's sake. Amen.